Before starting the story, please like and subscribe the channel. I am just an old lad that is trying hard to get by. Okay, let's dive into the story. Please watch till the end because the ending will have an unexpected turn. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to reconnect with nature and escape the stress of city life. My friend Tom and I rented a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods for a week. The idea was to unplug from our hectic lives, breathe in the fresh air, and enjoy the serenity of the forest. Little did we know, our retreat would turn into a living nightmare. From the moment we arrived, there was something off about the place. The cabin was old, with creaky wooden floors and dusty windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. It stood alone, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to close in on us, making the already overcast day feel even darker. As we unpacked our bags, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Did you hear that?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We both stood still, listening. The wind rustled through the trees, but there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like whispering. "It's just the wind," I said, trying to sound confident, but my words felt hollow. Tom nodded, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We busied ourselves with settling in, trying to ignore the growing tension. That first night, the unease turned into something more sinister. As we sat by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames doing little to dispel the chill in the air, we heard it again, the whispering. This time it was clearer, almost as if it was coming from inside the cabin. Tom and I exchanged nervous glances. "Maybe it's just the old wood settling," Tom suggested, but we both knew that was a weak explanation. We decided to turn in early, hoping a good night's sleep would make everything seem less eerie in the light of day. But sleep did not come easily. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the silence. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a soft, almost mournful humming. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the hallway. I glanced over at Tom, who was fast asleep in the bed across the room. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and crept toward the door. As I opened it, the humming stopped abruptly. I stood there, my breath caught in my throat, straining to hear anything in the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, stretching out into the darkness. I closed the door and returned to bed, but sleep was impossible. The rest of the night was spent in a restless state, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be lurking in the shadows. The next morning, I told Tom about the humming, but he shrugged it off. "You're just imagining things," and he said. "This place is old and creepy. It's easy to let your mind play tricks on you." I wanted to believe him, but the unease from the night before still lingered. We decided to explore the area around the cabin, hoping some fresh air and sunlight would help dispel the lingering sense of dread. As we hiked through the woods, the beauty of the surroundings did little to ease my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something unseen was following us. By late afternoon, we had circled back to the cabin, both of us more subdued than when we had set out. We decided to try and enjoy the rest of the day by the lake, a short walk from the cabin. The water was calm, and for a while the stillness was a welcome change. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the water, that familiar sense of unease returned. We cooked dinner over the fire pit, the smell of burning wood mingling with the scent of pine. But as darkness fell, the forest around us seemed to come alive. Every crackle of the fire seemed louder. Every rustle in the bushes seemed to hold unseen threats. I tried to focus on Tom's stories of past camping trips, but my attention kept drifting to the shadows at the edge of the clearing. That night, the humming returned, louder and more insistent. It seemed to come from all around the cabin, echoing off the walls and seeping into my bones. I lay there paralyzed with fear, listening to the haunting melody that seemed to draw closer with each passing second. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, I woke Tom. "Listen," I whispered, my voice trembling. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and then froze as the sound reached his ears. His face went pale. "What the hell is that?" he breathed. We both got up and cautiously made our way through the cabin, trying to locate the source of the sound. It led us to the living room. where the fire had long since died down to glowing embers. The room was bathed in an eerie red light, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And then we saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her hair hanging in tangled strands around her face, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She was the source of the humming, her lips moving soundlessly as she stared at us. Tom and I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The air around us grew colder, and the shadows seemed to reach out, clawing at our skin. The woman took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, and the humming grew louder, more insistent. It filled my head, drowning out all other thoughts until I thought I would go mad from the sound. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the woman stopped. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Leave," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. "Leave this place, or you will never escape." In a flash, she was gone, the room plunging into silence. Tom and I stood there shaking, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Finally, I found my voice. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his face pale and drawn. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the bedroom, too terrified to sleep. The humming didn't return, but the sense of dread hung heavy in the air. As soon as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, we packed our bags and left the cabin without looking back. The drive back to the city was a blur. Neither of us spoke, the silence filled with the unspoken terror of what we had experienced. It wasn't until we were safely back in the familiar chaos of the city that I finally felt the weight lift from my chest. But even then, the memory of that night lingered, a shadow that I couldn't quite shake. A few days later, I did some research on the cabin. It didn't take long to find stories of others who had experienced similar hauntings. Some said the cabin was cursed, built on land where terrible things had happened. Others spoke of a woman who had died there, her spirit unable to find peace. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. We were lucky to have escaped with our lives. Years have passed, but I still can't forget the woman's eyes, glowing with that unnatural light and the haunting melody of her song. The memory of that night is a scar that will never fully heal, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. And though I've tried to put it behind me, there are still nights when I wake to the sound of that ghostly humming echoing in the darkness. So here's the next story, but I bet this one is going to be more spine-chilling because it ends up in tragedy. Sarah decided to take a solo trip to the cabin on a whim. Life in the city had become overwhelming, and she needed a break from the constant noise and stress. The cabin, nestled deep in the heart of the forest, promised solitude and tranquility. It was the perfect place to clear her mind and find some peace. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected, the winding roads growing narrower and more treacherous as she ventured further into the wilderness. By the time she arrived, it was late afternoon, and the shadows were already stretching long across the ground. The cabin itself was quaint and charming, with a rustic charm that immediately put her at ease. Sarah spent the first few hours unpacking and exploring the area around the cabin. There was a small stream nearby, its gentle babbling a soothing soundtrack to the otherwise silent forest. The air was fresh and crisp, a welcome change from the smog-filled city. As the sun began to set, she started a fire in the fireplace and settled in for a quiet evening with a book. That first night, she slept soundly, the peacefulness of the forest a balm to her frayed nerves. But as the days went by, a sense of unease began to creep in. It started with small things, a misplaced item here, a strange noise there. At first, Sarah dismissed them as her imagination playing tricks on her. She was, after all, alone in an unfamiliar place. On the third night, things took a darker turn. She was jolted awake by a loud bang, as if something had slammed against the side of the cabin. Heart pounding, she grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made her way through the darkened cabin. Outside, the forest was still and silent, the trees casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. She saw nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Determined to not let fear ruin her trip, Sarah tried to put the incident out of her mind. The next day, she hiked deeper into the forest, hoping the physical exertion would help clear her head. The beauty of the surroundings was undeniable, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. Several times she stopped and listened, convinced she could hear footsteps behind her. Each time there was nothing. That night the noises returned. Soft whispers, the sound of footsteps just outside the cabin, and the same loud bang that had woken her the night before. Sarah locked the doors and windows, her hands trembling. She spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching a kitchen knife, her ears straining for any sound. By morning, she was exhausted and on edge. She decided she had had enough and planned to leave the cabin and return to the city. But when she went outside, she found her car's tires slashed and strange symbols carved into the hood. Panic set in. She was trapped, miles from civilization, with no way to call for help. Her phone had no signal, and the nearest town was hours away on foot. Desperation took hold. Sarah decided to hike out to the nearest road, hoping to flag down a passing car. She packed a bag with essentials and set off, the dense forest closing in around her. As the day wore on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. She quickened her pace, but the feeling of dread only intensified. It was late afternoon when she realized she was hopelessly lost. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the trees all looking the same. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into darkness, she heard it again, the soft whispers, growing louder, surrounding her. She broke into a run, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. Hours passed, and Sarah stumbled blindly through the forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to be coming from inside her own head. Exhausted and terrified, she finally collapsed in a small clearing, her body giving out from sheer fatigue. As she lay there staring up at the night sky, she saw movement at the edge of the clearing. Shadows shifted and coalesced into a figure, a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. He moved silently towards her, his gaze never leaving hers. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was the man's twisted smile as he reached for her. The search and rescue team found Sarah's body 3 days later, lying in the clearing where she had fallen. There were no visible injuries, no signs of foul play. The official cause of death was exposure, but the expressions on the faces of those who found her told a different story. They spoke of the terror etched into her features, the way her eyes seemed to stare into some unseen horror. The cabin was abandoned after that, a dark stain on the otherwise picturesque landscape. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the haunted cabin in the woods, warning anyone who would listen to stay away. And though the forest eventually reclaimed the cabin, the memory of Sarah's final, tragic trip lingered, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in even the most serene places.